One English private wrote in his diary,
"As soon as we started to advance, the bullets began to fly. All of a sudden, a Maxim began to play upon us. That stopped the firing line, for flat on their faces they fell, and devil of a move would they make at all."
The British have gone to war in South Africa very ill prepared for this type of warfare. Most of the generals who fought the Boers were used to people armed with spears and lances. Well, it was a shock for them. There were instances of surrender. People couldn't take it any longer. They just threw down their weapons and ran back. There were cries of cowardice.
I shall never forget the sight of the Highland Brigade after their terrible slaughter. As they came streaming back into our guns, they were no longer men. They had no nerves, did not know where they were. And some of the sights and things that happened, people in England, I'm glad to say, do not know of.
successive defeats shattered the confidence of the British public. Even the staunch Victoria was shaken.
No news today, only lists of casualties.
The war touched her personally when her own grandson, Prince Christian Victor, was numbered among the dead soldiers. The British stepped up their war effort. They shipped 250,000 troops to southern Africa. Slowly, the tide turned against the Boers. The Boer armies were defeated, but their young commandos continued a vicious guerrilla war. In retaliation, the British Commander-in-Chief, General Kitchener, pursued a war of attrition, burning farmsteads and rounding up women and children. He interned them in the world's first concentration camps.
This is carried out at a time when there is a massive typhus epidemic already in South Africa. And what happens is that large numbers of Boer civilians are exposed to typhus and cholera, and the result are death camps, which the British press and various British liberals expose as barbaric methods of warfare. European powers are hostile and portray the British Army as brutal. And certainly there is evidence that things were getting out of hand.
The mood of the Queen and the public remained stoutly patriotic, but the disasters of the Boer War fed a growing disillusionment from which the imperial ideal would never recover. Cecil Rhodes, the man who had done more than any other to start this war, had one more battle to fight. His heart condition made it difficult for him to breathe. He was carried to his little cottage on the coast in the hope that the fresh sea breezes would relieve his anguish. But here, at the age of 48, he finally lost his race with death. He had left orders that he was to be buried in Rhodesia, at a spot he called the View of the World. His grave was marked not with a cross, but with a massive stone. It was, in the words of a British High Commissioner, a haunted, sinister pagan place. Many of the attitudes that Rhodes had embodied were buried with him. The era of Victoria was over, and with it the unquestioning imperialism she had come to represent. Queen Victoria died in the evening of January 22, 1901. She was 81 years old. On her own instructions, she was dressed in white. Spring flowers were sprinkled over her body. Her face was covered by the veil she had worn at her wedding with Prince Albert 60 years before.
Queen Victoria's death was seen by many as the passing of an era. But also in 1901, there were fears that other powers were rising up, which might start to put pressure on Britain to yield its primacy in the world. So that the last days of the Queen's reign, there were fears and misgivings. Medical officers who'd inspected new recruits during the Boer War had concluded that 1 in 3 British working men was unfit for military service, were underfed, weak, and prone to disease. There were fears that the people talked about it quite openly, the imperial race was becoming weak. And if Britain was to rule the world, how could she do so with her own population, perhaps up to a quarter of it lived in destitution? As one socialist said, the sun never sets over the British Empire, it has never risen over the slums of London.
Rhodes had overstretched the empire. The Boer republics he had driven Britain to conquer were soon given independence. His aggressive spirit was to be replaced by a Gladstonian liberalism. Those ideals that Prince Albert had instilled in Victoria in the early years of her reign proved in the end to be more enduring than the harsh imperialism of her final decade.